כמה יזמים יש פה? רק ישראל תמיד היד. אז אחרים הם מה, סטודנטים? ובעלי עסקים שהם, לא יודע, שכירים בתחומי פינטק? Okay. Who does not understand Hebrew? Okay. If I do this in English, will the rest of you understand? Yeah, because somebody told me that they don't understand the Hebrew. Okay. So, thank you for inviting us. We were absolutely delighted that there is something called FinTech in the holy city of Jerusalem. And we, didn't spend too much time figuring out what this is. We said yes because we very much want to develop the FinTech community in Israel. We're pretty picky. So I'd like to begin by saying a general statement, and that is, so if you read Hebrew, just read the Hebrew, I'll just say things in English, that the payments industry has come to the forefront of everything innovation in the world and also in Israel. Paytech, as it's come to be known, seems to lead FinTech, and especially, or including in Israel. If you look at a few statistics from the Start of Nation Central, this is 2020, because I went a full year. There are more updated numbers now, with Q1 and maybe Q2 will be up soon as well. But if you look at the entire FinTech industry, and the entire high-tech industry in Israel in terms of capital that was raised, the biggest sector was cybersecurity. Sorry? Is there a pointer on here? Anyway, the leading sector was cybersecurity, and number two is FinTech. What's very interesting is that 1 quarter later, FinTech jumped ahead of cybersecurity. So as of Q1 2021, the FinTech sector raised more money than any other sector in Israel, which is fabulous. And if you break down FinTech into subcategories, this is not our numbers, these are numbers from startupcentral.com, or whatever, which is an organization that tracks all the high-tech numbers in Israel. Payments is the highest, raised more money than anything else. These are the subcategories of payments: credit cards, cryptocurrency, digital wallets, invoices, transactions, billing, mobile payments, and checks. Checks are still part of our world, and I will say a few words about checks as well. So, in my part of the Bank of Israel, we are charged with overseeing payment systems, and they enable various payment methods. I want to just take you through a few things that affect your life on a daily basis. So some of you said that you were employees of FinTech companies, and you see probably a copy of a salary stub that is similar to what you get every month on the upper left. You usually get paid your salary by an ACH transfer, wire transfer, that goes over a payment system that we regulate, and there are innovations there as well. Next to that, you'll see a phone, and maybe you noticed that in the last year or so, many digital wallets launched in Israel, so you can tap with your phone and pay at the point of sale. That wasn't possible as recently as a year and a half ago. You see a lady buying there online. Much of the e-commerce has moved internationally. People are buying a lot from China, especially during COVID-19. But what's perhaps interesting that happened during COVID-19 is that while we're used to doing a lot of our shopping physically, so much of it moved offline and nothing went wrong. So literally billions of shekels moved from physical transactions to remote transactions, and we just assumed it would work. Let's not assume that. That's a pretty big technological effort overseen by us at the Bank of Israel. See the check there. So I have a story to tell about checks, which I'll tell a bit later, but it's very interesting that we led a reform at the Bank of Israel that told all the banks, don't send us checks anymore. Because banks need to somehow deliver and receive the checks, right? If I write, what's your name with the yellow socks?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Lev? If I write you a check, I usually have colorful socks too, by the way. So if I write you a check, then my bank needs to, or you're going to try to deposit it. So your bank needs to deliver the check to my bank, right? That somehow needs to be cleared. So that used to be done physically until not too long ago, using trucks, which was crazy. And now we're at the point that we've required all the banks to scan the checks. So we don't get physical checks at all, we get images. And we also required the banks to allow each of you to use your mobile app to scan a check. But unfortunately, when you write the check, it's still a piece of paper. We're even making that digital as well. So checks are actually a digital payment instrument, but we present them in paper still. And the last thing I wanted to mention was the ATM networks. So what's digital about that? It's cash. But think about it, it's just like checks. If I am a client of a customer of, I don't know, First International Bank of Israel, and I go to an ATM machine, which is not even an ATM machine that works for the bank, how is that ATM system going to get its money from the bank? That needs to go through a settlement system for ATMs, which is also something we oversee. You had a question? You're limiting me in time, and I have a lot of information, but go ahead, make it quick.
But all over the world.
Yes.
The same changes. So what is the role of that computer?
So all over the world, there is one person in every country, like me, whose job is to do what we're talking about. I'm not saying that we're better than other countries. In fact, I'm saying we're pretty far behind a lot of other countries in some spaces. We're better in other spaces. I'm not here to prove that we're better than anyone else. I'm just here to share the knowledge with you so you understand what the ecosystem looks like. And hopefully, if you're an entrepreneur, if you work for a fintech company, you might think about an opportunity for yourself or perhaps a risk that you need to manage. So when we say payment systems, what do we mean? In the payment ecosystem, there is always a customer, you see on the left, a co-op, who works with a payment service provider, PSP. What is a payment service provider? It could be a bank, it could be a fintech, it could be a big tech, it could be one of the Israeli credit card companies. It's an entity that helps you move money. You can move money through a check, through a debit card, a credit card, a prepaid card, through an ATM machine, through an ACH payment, through a faster payment. But there are entities that do this for you. So you are a client or customer of that entity. And then that entity needs to move money to another entity, which is also a payment service provider. The example that I gave, also a bank. And that other entity has a client. That client could be a business or it could be another person. So in the example that I had with the gentleman with the yellow socks, here he's not necessarily a store, he's a person, right? But our banks needed to connect somehow. But if you were a store and I wanted to pay you as a store, same thing, your store would need to go to its bank. Now, PSPs traditionally were banks, and the vast majority of volumes of money that moves are still banks, bank-driven. But payments are not a bank product. We have another division of the Bank of Israel, which is called the Supervisor of Banks. They have lots to do, and they also regulate the payment activity of the banks. However, the payment industry, perhaps the more innovative side of the payment industry in some countries, doesn't necessarily come from banking. It could come from the fintechs, the big techs, and other spaces. And we'll talk a little bit about what's happening in Israel. We're finally very close to enabling non-banks to connect as well to these payment systems. So, if I could move this. So I'll take you through a few of the payment systems in Israel. You may have heard of Shva. Who's heard of Shva? Okay. So Shva is a national, it's a good thing you've never heard of them. You shouldn't hear of them. You don't care about them, you're a consumer. If you hear about them, then there's a problem. And our job is to make sure there's no problem. But Shva has three main participants in its system that move money, payment service providers. Cahal, also known as Visa Cahal, Max, formerly known as the Cahal, an Isla. I bet every single one of you have a credit card from at least one of these companies, and they connect through Shva. That's 1 billion shekels of volume every day in a market of 8 million people. That's significant volume. If we look at another payment system called Masad, who's heard of Masad? Same people. That payment system connects all of the banks for wire transfers. And when I said that our salary gets paid through a payment system, it's also known as ACH, Automated Clearinghouse, moving money, transferring money between banks using ACH goes on a payment system called Masad, and all the participants in that payment system are the banks that you see on the screen. I mentioned ATMs before. The ATM system has direct participants who are near the circle, and then indirect participants who are farther outside the circle. They connect through one of the banks, typically. Sorry. And then we have the RTGS system. There's no way I'm finishing this in 5 minutes, so sorry, get ready to stay late. The ATM system also connects, Zahav system, RTGS. So have you ever done a Zahav transfer? Anybody here? So it enables you, it's a non-refundable, irreversible movement of money. You probably know it as individuals. What people don't realize and shouldn't care about is that banks move money between them using the RTGS system, which has literally hundreds of billions of shekels moving through it every day. And that is something that we operate at the Bank of Israel. And some of the systems that connect to move money are the settlement systems that I mentioned earlier. I'm not finishing in 3 minutes, so I don't know. So, all right, he wants you to finish quickly. A few things that I'll say about the Israel market. It is actually very advanced. People tend to think of it as backwards, but we tend to, when I was at Visa, we measured markets by the penetration of digital payments. At Visa, we measured the penetration of transactions on Visa cards. So you look at the total private consumer expenditure in the market. This is statistics that's published every year. It's published every month, I think, and every quarter. And then we look at the total volumes of a particular payment method, and we see how much of total private consumer expenditure is on cards. How much of it is it cash, which if it's too high, then we think it's not an advanced market. How much of it is checks? And in Israel, 47% of private consumer expenditure is on cards. That's extremely high by international standards. If we remove housing and cars, expenses relating to buying a car, then it jumps to around 60%. So this is a very advanced market. We can complain about it. We love to complain. However, the penetration was very high before we made the advances that we made. So I want to tell you about something we did as a regulator, which is actually interesting. And what is your name? Tzvi? Tzvi. This is unique to Israel. So historically, we had plastic cards all over the world with a magnetic stripe. And then in some countries, they started putting a little chip in the card. They call it smart cards, smart transactions. In the technical language, it's called EMV, okay? I'll tell you something. EMV means Euro card, MasterCard, Visa. It's nothing special. But anyway, it means there was a chip in the card. Why did people deploy chips in cards around the world? Because fraud on magnetic stripe cards was very high, because you could copy the information from the magnetic stripe easily. We didn't need that in Israel because we had one of the most advanced credit card infrastructures in the world. We managed fraud at the point of sale, nobody else did, better than all the countries that had deployed EMV. So people said, why spend money on EMV? But what happened later is that in other markets, they took a small little antenna and attached it to the chip card. Inside the plastic, you didn't see it. If you cut your cards open, you'll see a little antenna. And then they took the chip and the little antenna and put it in your mobile phone. And then you could take the card and put it near the credit card terminal, or the phone near the credit card terminal, and hear a beep, and that's how you pay without touching contactless payment. You're all nodding, but 2 years ago you had no idea what this was as an Israeli consumer. Whereas already in 2005, this was being deployed in other markets. So we realized that the only way to move Israel to the EMV infrastructure and enable this type of digital wallet and all the good stuff that comes with it is to require the credit card companies, to require the businesses to upgrade their credit card terminals. This is quite a long process. This is hundreds of 200,000 terminals across the country. And it's not like people are going to make money, they're going to have to spend money on this. More expensive cards and more expensive terminals. We have now achieved, we started this a year and a half ago, we have now achieved 67% or 66% penetration of terminals. And as a result of that, we see that large volumes of, I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but large volumes of the transactions are now contactless. Is there anyone here who has not paid as using a contactless card or payment? Shelly, but you know, you're an English speaker, so that makes no sense.
I have Revolut.
You still need to pay.
It's got to get paid.
Okay. When we did that, and the market understood this was happening, all these digital wallets launched at the top of the screen, 7 of them, and 4 other digital wallets announced that they're launching. Think how crazy that is. There's also another one that's not on here because it's not public knowledge. So why is there a picture of orange juice here? Because literally this morning, my car is in the shop. I had to go, I was meeting friends early in the morning in the park with a trader to do some training. And I ran out of the house quickly on my son's bicycle because I didn't have a car. And on the way home, I really wanted fresh orange juice and I had no way to pay for it. But I had a digital wallet in my phone, and thanks to that, I was able to pay. And another interesting thing that happened that I just saw a couple of days ago is that now Apple Pay, which launched as a digital wallet, can work with Rav-Kav online. So even not as a digital wallet, it's an online payment mechanism. That's a way of saying, once we make a small move, this is a relatively small move that has triggered additional market entrants, such as Apple Pay, which came here as a digital wallet, suddenly we also see new payment experiences online through new market entrants. So my main message to you is, whether it's in Israel or in other markets, track regulation very carefully, because those, fintech regulation, because those people who understood that we were moving the market to EMV and NFC acceptance, NFC is near field communication, saw the opportunity and were able to get to market first and get those volumes. And that's true in so many places. So just a few other things that we're doing as a regulator so you can keep track. So cross-border payments, we're looking to decrease the number of days it takes consumers and businesses to send and receive payments internationally. Shelly's an English speaker, so he knows what I'm talking about. I'm kidding, everybody does. And that's also true for businesses. I'll say as a general matter, one of our challenges in Israel is that there are major fintech unicorns in this country not operating locally. And we'd like them to operate locally. And there are 2 or 3 who specialize just in cross-border payments. They've become global market leaders, and we're going to see what we can do to bring them locally. And also, why not global players who are not in Israel yet at all? They would be interested in the Israel market. And I can tell you that they are interested in the Israel market, and they're talking to us. People always say this market's too small. It's not true. We have very significant numbers here, and there are markets with smaller economies where some of these innovations have been implemented, and they haven't come to Israel. I'm going to pick out the ones that are relevant for entrepreneurs. So, the third one, enabling new forms of payment on the existing points of sale in the stores. So we're not going to force all the stores to upgrade again, but we're looking at what other forms of payment can we enable customers to use besides payment cards.
CBDC, for example.
CBDC, for example, and I'll maybe talk about the next one, דיגיטליים. So we're going to migrate all of the checks, we're going to try to migrate the checks to digital format. So instead of having to take out a piece of paper and writing it, you'll be able to do it digitally and then maybe also be able to pay at the point of sale in digital format.
Will you also actually create those checks and give them to the bank?
No, We create the standards, and we oversee the implementation of the standards.
Private companies will come in and
Yes, and that is an opportunity. And I have 3 companies talking to me about that. And there is a lot of room. Checks are big in Israel.
You don't publicize in advance and say, guys, this is a game fight over who's first. How does it work?
We don't let one player. We establish standards. Part of our mission is to enable a fair playing field. And so we want more than one company to be able to access the payment systems. But we do work with all the players. This is why it's a slower process than in other spaces. We work with all the players to make sure they can work with the standards that we're thinking of implementing. Absolutely. And that also relates to the second one from the top here called faster payments. It's in a bigger category called A2A. Other names for faster payments around the world, if you want to research it, are instant payments or immediate payments. What it means is you can do an account-to-account transfer. Remember we talked about the ACH platform usually takes 2 to 3 business days. Faster payments are immediate. That platform has already been implemented in Israel, partially implemented in Israel, and we're working on moving it to the next step. And in some markets, it's expected to compete with card payments. So why not enable faster payments at the point of sale? So the money will come out of the bank account, and you'll see the debit, and the recipient will see the credit immediately. And third-party players can provide an app, both to the business, both to the recipient, and to the payer to make it happen. The top one there is viewing the government as a catalyst for expediting the adoption of digital payments. So one thing that happens in Israel and in other markets is the government is last to adopt new forms of payment, whereas the government should be first because it's often the regulator that's pushing new forms of payment, so we're doing a lot on that front. We're also working to give non-banks direct access to the payment systems, and we're also working to develop a national identity platform. So it already exists. Some of you may have signed up. You can, your ID number, your address, your date of birth, your email address, your phone number are all available in this database. 2 million Israelis have already signed up, but it doesn't have your bank account number or credit card number. So why do you need that? So a fintech doesn't have access to a large number of customers with all their personal information, which is required for know your customer procedures and for authentication at the time of payment. And it's a barrier to entry for some of you. So once you'll have this national ID database, including bank account information, all the user will need to do is give you their email address and give you their consent. You can already connect to their bank account or credit card. Thank you. Maybe just one sentence. If you are affiliated with a big tech or fintech, which is an established company, not somebody that's raising a seed round, and thinking about working in payments, and you identify a barrier to entry that's regulatorily driven, approach us, because we want to make sure there is a level playing field built. Okay.
So basically, I think that we have excellent payment infrastructure, and there we have in your plans additional improvements. So why do we need the digital check?
If it ain't broken, why fix it? So why do we need digital wallets? Why do we need to move to EMV? It's a very good question. I think if you talk to people who use the digital wallets, they're absolutely in love with the experience. It's for the benefit of the customer. The reason I put the orange juice up there and the Ravka, it actually has improved people's lives, okay, in one way or another. And there are other reasons. There are things like platforms for providing credit to underserved populations and small businesses. So a normal lender wouldn't take the risk if they didn't have all the data they need to make smart lending decisions. And there's also a very good question around, do we need central bank digital currency at all in the world? And I've talked about different use cases of where it might help. The best answer I heard to that question was Dani Tzidon, who was a very senior banker. Latest place he was Bank Leumi, and now he's a private investor. And it was a forum where we talked about this, and he said, Not many of you are old enough to remember when the government was contemplating Vishesh, because it was bad for the environment, and the roads worked. You could get from point A to point B, and why spend all this money, and why turn the whole country upside down? And Vishesh has completely revolutionized transportation in Israel. Would you even think about ground transportation here without Vishesh? And he said, you know, maybe we can't identify the exact use case or the killer use case, but I think, he said, Vishesh might, CBDC might be the Vishesh of the financial industry going forward. It's a very strategic answer. It's the one I get better than all the others. We have lots of specific use cases. I think one very interesting one is delivery versus payment. So you can do a lot of very smart programmable money type of stuff. You said two. One more.
One more. Is there a link offer on government Schwab?
I'm sorry?
Is there a link offer on government Schwab? Of course.
So, Shva is what we call a systemic platform, right? So it is huge and it benefits from scale. However, Shva is quite cheap. If you compare Shva to similar systems around the world, Shva is probably the cheapest, if not one of the cheapest, and its resilience is very high. Its uptime is very high. It is now public company. However, the value of the company is different from the cost to the participants.
The value comes from the fees that you pay.
We can take this offline, okay? I worked at Visa. We had many of our own platforms. We looked at domestic platforms. One of the reasons it was so difficult and impossible to enter this market and compete with Shva was because their pricing was so low and they had so many benefits and features, it just wasn't sensible financially that you could try to compete with them. However, the answer to your question is yes, it is possible. You need to understand the use case where you could excel in comparison with them. Start there.
And the government will give the license?
So, payment systems do not get licenses. Payment service providers and banks do get licenses. Payment service providers still don't have the ability to get a license because we're trying to pass a law that will enable you to get a license as a payment service provider, which competes with the bank. But Shva is a payment system. We only start regulating payment systems when they become systemic, meaning when we believe that a collapse or a problem will impact the entire economy. There are many payment systems that are not regulated. For example, you use CBUS or 10BIS, right? Those are payment systems that move money between payer and payee, and they're not regulated. Why? Because they're not systemic. So payment systems are not, you don't need a license to start a payment system. You do when it becomes systemic.
How do you connect all the banks and credit card companies?
Sorry?
Technically, how do you bring the banks and the credit companies to work with you? Shva's working with everyone.
The question isn't the technical question, the question is the business question. Technically, it's possible.
Did they think you might get it?
We need to go. Yeah, we'll take it offline. So thank you for the opportunity. Hope you learned something, and we're around.